And when it is a number, it will return false. But we want the exact opposite, right? So we can simply use the not operator here. And this way it will be true if it is a number, and it will be false if it's not a number. And now all we need is the AND operator here. So we want this to happen at the same time. The input description should not be empty, and the number should actually be a number. So it should not be not a number. So this is already pretty good, but we can do even better, because imagine the case that the input value is 0. That is also not really an expense or an income, right? But it's still a number, so it will pass this test here, right? So what we can do is to simply add input value should be greater than 0. So makes sense? And now all of this only happens in case that these three conditions are all true at the same time. And that's why we use the AND operator. So this is what we want always to happen, because without this we don't have any data at all to test. But all of the other stuff, so adding the new item and to the budget controller and to the UI, clear the fields, and all of this should only happen if there is actually some significant data that we can use. So let's now test this. Okay, so if we now hit this here, nothing happens. If we add something just like this, but without the number, also nothing happens. And now let's put 12. Okay, so now it worked. Now let's test only with the number, and it does not work. So test 2, and now it should work. So I hit return. All right, and now let's add another test, test 3, with 0. So it should also not work, right? And it doesn't, so great. But 0, 1 works. So we have 1 here. So perfect. So all of the problems are solved now, and so we're ready to move on to actually do the real calculations. Let's now do the actual calculations of the total incomes, total expenses, and the budget. And so in this lecture you're going to learn how and why to create simple, reusable functions with only one purpose each, and also how to sum all elements of an array using the for each method. So let's go to work. So this is how we left the update budget function in the controller after the last lecture. So it's now time to calculate the budget here in step 1, and for that we're going to create a public method in the budget controller, right? And so it's up here, and I'm going to call it calculate budget. So very simple. And it's a function, of course. And in here there's a couple of things that we have to do. So I call this the calculate budget function, but in fact we're also going to calculate first the sum of all incomes as well as the sum of all the expenses. So the total income and the total expenses. And then of course the budget, which is one minus the other, and then also the percentage. So let's show that on the user interface. So this is the percentage that I'm talking about. And this is very simply the percentage of our income here that we have already spent, so which are expenses. So let's write all we have to do here. So calculate total income and expenses, then calculate the budget, which will of course be income minus the expenses, right? And then finally calculate the percentage of income that we spent, basically. Okay, so let's start at the beginning right here. So calculate the total income and expenses. So this sounds like we're going to do the same thing 2 times, right? Once for the income and once for the expenses. So I think this sounds like making an extra function for this, right? So a function that receives if it's either the income or the expenses that we're talking about, so that we want, and then sum all of the items. Okay, and since we don't want no one else to use this function, we can make it simply a private function. So it's just an internal function to help this calculate budget method. Okay, so I'm going to do it out here, and I'm simply going to call it calculate total. So calculate total. And then what we need to say here is simply if we want to calculate the total expenses or the total incomes. So we're again going to use our type keyword. Okay. Okay, so how are we going to do that? So we already know that all of our items are stored here in the all items object, right? And all the expenses are in this array and all the incomes are in this array, right? So at some point of our application, there are going to be a couple of objects in both this and this array here. So what we need to do is to get this array, then loop over it, and then sum all of the values. So add all of the values together. And so the first thing that we need to do is to simply create a sum variable, which will store the sum, okay, and set it to 0, because that's of course the initial value. Okay, and then we loop over this array. And do you remember a great way that we learned in one of the last lectures about looping over an array? It was the for each method, right? So let's get our array and use the for each method on it. So data, which is where all of this is stored, then the all items object, okay, and then, such as we did before, we use our type argument to select if you want to expense array or the income array, right? So this type here will of course be either exp or either inc, such as we've been using before. Alright, so this is the array, and now we can use the for each method. And remember, this accepts a callback function, okay? So function, and then this function here has access to a couple of parameters. Remember that? So we can access the current value, the current index, and also the complete array. In this case, we only need the current element, okay? So I'm going to call it cur simply. And remember, we can do that. We can call it whatever we want. And so now I say that the sum should be equal to the previous sum plus the current value. And so it's cur.value. And it's cur.value because value is the name that we gave it here, right? So in the expense and in the income, they both have this property called value, which is where we store the value. And so this cur here now refers to either the income or the expense object that is stored at the current position of the expense or the income array, okay? Okay, just to illustrate this, let me just write a simple example here, okay? Just so this makes more sense to you. So the initial sum is 0, right? And imagine we have an array which has these sums, so 200, 400, and 100, for example, okay? So in the beginning, our sum is 0. So in the first iteration, our sum is 0. And so the sum will be 0 plus 200, because it's the first element of the array. The first value in this case. So notice that these are only values. This is just an example to see you how this iteration works and how we calculate the final sum. So in the next iteration, then our sum is already 200, right? And so now sum is equal to 200 plus the 400 from the next element. So this is 600. And so in the next loop, in the next iteration, it will be 600 plus 100. So 700 in the end. Alright, so this is how this loop works. Now we can do this better, right? Remember, there's this operator where we can put the plus here, and then we don't need this. So this is a bit simpler. And so after this loop, we have our sum stored here in this value. And what are we going to do with this then? We could return it, but I think it's even better to store it in our global data structure. So in our global data model, which we have here, okay, so this data object, which contains all of our information. And so in here, we before already put this totals object. So now we can use this in store or sums in here, right? So let's do that. Data.totals. And then again, we use our type, because once again, there's expenses and income. And then we simply say that this should be equal to the sum that we just calculated. And that's it. So this function is completed now. So let's use it here in practice. So we're going to go back to our calculate budget method. And so now I can call our private function. So I just say calculate total, and here it is. And I first do it with the expenses, and then I do it with the income. And that's it. So after running these two lines, or a data structure here has these two values here filled, so they are not 0 anymore. So they are now set to the total expense and the total incomes. Okay, and now we just need to calculate the budget. And where do you think I should store this budget? Exactly. Once again, we are going to use our global data structure that we have here. So we're going to create a variable in here called budget and set it initially to 0, okay? And now we can go ahead and fill this value here with our budget that we're going to calculate. So we say data.budget will be equal to the income minus the expenses. And remember where these values are stored? Exactly, they're also in the data structure. So data, and now remember they're in the totals dot income. And now minus data.totals dot expenses. Okay, so this retrieves these two values here from our data structure, then calculates one minus the other, and then stores it again in the data structure in the budget property. And now the final task of this method is to calculate the percentage of income that we spent. So once again, let's create a new property here and simply call this one percentage, and also set it to 0 in the beginning. Or actually, let's set it to -1, because -1 is usually a value that we use to say that something is non-existent. So if there are no budget values and no total expenses and incomes, then there cannot be a percentage. So we set it not to 0 but to -1, so it doesn't exist at this point. And so now we can store the percentage that we calculate also in the data structure. So data.percentage. So the percentage of income that we spent is the expenses divided by the incomes, okay? So data totals expenses divided by data totals dot income. Okay, so just an example, let's see. Imagine we have an expense of 100 and an income of 200. Then we spend 50% of our income, right? So this is equal to 100 divided to 200, right? And this is actually 0.5, so we have to multiply it by 100. So let's do that here as well. So I'm going to put some parentheses here, which are actually not necessary. But this way it looks a bit better, a bit more structured. Now the thing is that this will have a decimals. So imagine it would be here, instead of 100, it would be 300. Then we would have spent 33.333 and so on. So this would be 0.3333. But we don't want that, really just want this integer part here. So let's also round this result. And we already did that before. So remember, we used the math object, and in here there's a nice method called round. And so this will round whatever we input here to the closest integer. Okay, and with this, we calculate our percentage. So we have now everything that we wanted this method to do. So we have our total income and expense, we have our budget, and our percentage. So let's now use this method in our global app controller. So this is down here, so calculate the budget. So we say budget controller, as you already know, and then our newly created method, which is calculate budget. Alright, so this calculates the budget. And now we need a method which returns the budget to us so that we can store it here in a variable and then pass it on to the user interface controller, which is then going to display it here in this third point. So let's do that very quickly. So again, in our budget controller, we need a new method, and this is going to be called getBudget. And again, I'm doing it like this. I'm creating a method only for returning something from our data structure or from our module, so that you get used to this whole philosophy of having functions that only retrieve data or functions that only set data. So let's write this very simple method here. And again, budget returns not only to the budget itself, but also to the total incomes and expenses and the percentage as well. So we want to return these 4 values. And what's the best way to return 4 or even more values at the same time? Exactly, we're going to use an object. So we simply do it like this. Return this object. And in here, we now create the 4 properties for the 4 values. So budget will be data.budget, right? Because remember, that is the place where we store the result of that calculation. Okay? Then we want the total income. So just like this. And this is stored also in the data structure, in the totals, and then in the inc property. Now the same for the expenses. And finally, we also want the percentage, of course. And that's it. That's all that this function, that this method here has to do. So let's now use it here. And this time we return something, so we have to store it in a variable, of course. So let's simply call it budget, okay? So var budget is the result of calling budget controller dot get budget. And that's it. So now we should have the budget stored here in this variable. So we are ready to display it in the user interface, but I'm going to leave that to the next lecture. So right now I just want to console log this object so that we can see if everything we did before is working, okay? So budget here. And remember, this whole update budget function is called each time we enter a new item into the user interface, right? So let me see. So it comes from here. Okay. So the control add item function is called each time that we input a new element. Okay, so this calls the update budget function, which is this one, which then in turn calls all of these methods here. So the calculate budget and get budget methods. So this console.log here will appear in the console each time we input a new item. So let's now test this. So let's say project and okay. So down here we have our budget object, okay? And let's take a look at it. So the total expenses are 0, the total income is 2100, and the budget is of course 2100, and there's no percentage. So everything seems to be working, right? Let's just add another one. So I sold my car again for $1,500. And so let's see the budget now. So this is the sum of 2100 plus 1500, and this makes 3,600. And the budget is also 3,600 because we don't have any expenses yet. So let's say we went on a holiday, which was $1,800, and now here we are. Oh, actually I did this wrong. I put it in as another holiday, as another income, so I have to change this, of course. So let's now say holiday for 3,600. That's because I want to show you the exact percentage. Okay, so now this seems to be working. So the budget is 1,800 because it's 5,400 minus 3,600. Yeah, makes sense. And then the percentage is 67. And that's because, let's calculate it here, 3,600 divided by 5,400 is this number here. And if we multiply this by 100, then it gives us 67% if we round this, okay? So this is actually working. So there's only one thing to correct, and let me just reload this for that. Imagine that we only have expenses, okay? So let's say again, holiday for $900, and now we have this problem here. The percentage gives us this weird infinity value. So infinity. And that's because we cannot divide anything by 0, which is what we attempted to do here. So we did 900 divided by 0 because you don't have any income yet. And that is not allowed in mathematics, and so we have to fix that in our code. So let's go back to the method where we calculate this, and it's right here. So what we have to say is that we only want this calculation when we already have some income. So when the total income is greater than 0. So let's use an if statement. So if the data totals income is greater than 0, then we want this to happen, okay? And if it's not, then we simply want the data percentage to be -1, which, as I explained before, is basically the non-existence. So when there's no percentage to calculate, we just say it's -1, and we'll use that -1 later when we display this percentage on the user interface, okay? So let's now very quickly test this again. So add an expense, holiday for $900, and now here it is. So now our percentage is -1, and everything else is also working. So the total budget is negative, of course, because 0 minus 900 is -900. So the next step is, of course, to add this budget here to our user interface right here in this field. So here, and here, and here, and here. So let's do that right in the next lecture. Now comes the fun part, where we'll finally see the budget updating on the user interface. And since this will be a shorter lecture, we will just practice some more DOM manipulation by updating the budget and total values in the user interface. So of course we need to add a new method here to our user interface controller, right? And let's call it display budget. And let's put it here. So display budget. And what do we need here in order to be able to actually print the budget? Of course, we need the object where all of this data is stored. So I'm going to call it obj, just like we did before. And this will then contain the 4 pieces of data that we want to print here, right? So the budget, the total income, the total expense, and also the percentage. So we're going to do some more DOM manipulation, and in order to do that, we need to know the class names of the elements on our user interface that we want, right? And so once again, we're going to add some more strings here to our DOM strings object so that we can use them then in our methods. So let's go to our HTML file where our user interface is stored, right? And so this is here in the top part. as I showed you right in the beginning. So the actual budget value, which will be stored here, so right here, this is this, will be called budget value. So let me copy this and then paste it here. And I'm going to call it budget label, because these basically act as labels in the user interface, okay? So the class selector and then the class name. Alright, so next one. So now we need our total income, which is here, right? And the total expenses is down here in this div element. So let's just check. So it's this here and this. So these are called budget income value and budget expenses value down here. So let's add these two as well. So let me call this income label. And actually I didn't copy it. Okay. So now it's here. And now the expense label. So income and expenses. And finally the percentage as well. So let me check that as well. And it's here. So this is called budget expenses percentage. And copied this as well. And now percentage label. And now we're ready to use this. So remember, we store all of these class names here in this central object that we have here, so that we don't have all of these class names here floating around in all of these methods, okay? And so if something changes in the user interface, we can simply come here and update all of these class names if we want. So this makes our lives as programmers much easier, having this kind of structures. Okay, now we already know how to display all of these values on our web page, right? So we have done this a lot of time. So we use document.query selector and then DOM-strings.budget label, which is the first one. And then in this case, we don't want to change the HTML, but only the text content. So we say text content, okay? And now this should be equal to the budget. And this budget comes here from the object that we passed into this method. So object.budget. And that's it. And now I'm just going to duplicate this line because we already know how to do this, right? So now I just need to replace a couple of things here to make it work. So the income label, right? And now we need to know the name of the property where the total income is actually stored. So let's go back to where we generate this object. So remember, it's here in the getBudget method. So this is where we create the object that's going to be returned to the app controller, which then passes it into the displayBudget method that we're working on right now. Let me just copy this so that I have the names here. Okay. So this one is called total inc. In here it's the expenses label, right? And this one is called, as we see, total exp. We're just going to copy it. And then here, this one is called percentage label. And this should be percentage label. Let me change it in both places. Okay. And now this one is simply called percentage. So I'm copy and paste. And now before we can see this in action, we need to, of course, call this method here, right? And also add this comma. Okay, so this playBudget is the method that we're going to call. Oh yeah, it's here. So before we had this console log here, which we don't need anymore. And so now we use the UI controller to call the displayBudget method. And now what we have to pass in here is the object that we called budget, right? So this object here, which is, as I showed you a couple of moments ago, the object that is returned from the getBudget method. Okay, and now we're ready to check this out. So project 1500, and all right, it works. So the budget is 1500, our income is 1500, and our expenses are 0. Let's now add another one, salary, let's say 2500, and now it should be 4000, right? So let's see. And yes, it is. So it updated very nicely here. And now I'm going to add an expense as well. And I'm going to call it holiday again for 1200. And it works. So we see 1200 here, then our budget, which is now 2800, and then the percentage here is also correct. So with this holiday here, we now know that we spent 30% of the money that we made in this month. Now we don't only want this to be 30 here, right? So let's add the percentage sign here. And actually there's another thing that we have to do. So let's reload this. And let's simply add an income. So now we have -1%. And we don't want the user to see -1%, right? Because that doesn't make any sense at all. So we need to be prepared for this case and display something else there. So let's do this. So back to the display budget method here. We basically need an if-else statement here, right? So we say if there is a percentage, so if it's not -1, then we want to add the percentage sign. So if it's 30, we want to display 30%. But if it's -1, we simply want to display something else. So let's say if object percentage is greater than 0, then we want this to happen here. Let me cut this from here and paste it here. So we want this object percentage plus the percentage sign, right? But if it's not, we want something else. So we don't want to see the percentage value here, but we want to see something that shows us that there is nothing to show actually. So let's put simply some of these dashes. So this shows that it's empty. And notice that this is not only going to happen when the percentage is -1, but also when it's 0, right? Because in here we said greater than 0. So this only happens, so this percentage is only shown if the percentage is greater than 0 and not if it's greater or equal. But that's totally okay. So let's see that in action. So I'm going to add a holiday for 1200. And yeah, now we have these 3 dashes that we had before. Cool, right? Let's now add a salary for us of 2400. And now we see that we spend 50%. So now it's working really good. Only one small thing that we can improve now is, you see when we reload this, then we have these weird numbers here that we obviously don't want, right? So remember, there's something that runs each time that our application starts. And do you remember what that is? Yes, it is the init function. So we can not only call this method that we just created each time that we input a new item, but we can call it right in the beginning when we start to run our application. So let's copy this. And then say that we want to run this right in the beginning. Now the thing is that we don't want to pass the budget in here, right? Because what we want is basically to reset everything. So we want everything to be set to 0. So what we need to pass here is actually an object similar to the budget object, but with everything set to 0. So let's just grab this object from up here, okay? And put everything to 0. So very simple. So back to our init function, okay, here. Let's pass this object, but we set everything to 0. So the budget is 0, the total income is 0, the total expense is 0, and the percentage is not 0, but -1. So there's no percentage at all. So let's check this now. So when we reload, everything should be set to 0, right? And yes, here it is. So no budget, no income, no expenses, and no percentage to show. Okay, and with this, we have actually finished everything that we had planned for the first step of building this application. And it already looks pretty cool, right? So great work so far. So we can now already do a lot of stuff with this, but there are actually still a lot of more cool features coming up over the next lectures. So with the last lecture, we completed the first step of our app. Congratulations for that. You have come a really long way. So let's now take a look at the structure of the app that we have built so far, so that we can then outline what to do next. Alright, so this is how I like to represent the structure and architecture of an app like the one that we're building right now. So we have our three modules, so the budget controller, the app controller, and the UI controller, and in each one of them we can see the functions or methods that we have written so far. And then with these green arrows we see the connections between them, so that we can see functions calling other functions. So this really helps us to get a nice overview of what we're doing here, right? So it really makes it easier to plan and organize our app and code. For example, we can see the effect that a simple click on our input button has, which is this green dot here that represents an event. And there will be more of them in the future. So as we know from our code, clicking this button will call the control add item function, which will then call all of the other functions and methods that we see here connected with the green arrows. So again, this gives us a very nice high-level overview of our app. And I really advise you that you always draw up something like this for your own apps or whatever you're gonna do with JavaScript. Let's now continue with the planning and see what we can do in step 2 of building our app. So far, we can input data into our app, which is then stored in a data structure and displayed on the user interface. What's missing here is the functionality of deleting an item from this list. So let's take care of that now. So we already have our delete buttons in the UI, but they are not doing any work yet, right? So once more, we start by adding an event handler to them. We then go ahead and delete this entire row as soon as the user clicks the button, both from our data structure and from the UI. And after that, of course, we also need to recalculate the budget and update it here on the user interface. Alright, so we have a nice little to-do list here again, so let's get back to work right now. Before we can start implementing our code to delete items from our application, we need to talk about something called event delegation, which is a very important and much used concept in JavaScript programming when we interact with a DOM. Alright, so in order to talk about event delegation, the first concept that we actually need to talk about is event bubbling. And event bubbling means that when an event is fired or triggered on some DOM element, for example by clicking on our button here on the right side, then the exact same event is also triggered on all of the parent elements. So again, the event is first fired on the button, but then it will also be fired on all the parent elements, one at a time. So it will also fire on the paragraph, the section, the main element, and actually all the way up in the DOM tree until the HTML element, which is the root. So we say that the event bubbles up inside the DOM tree, and that's why it's called bubbling. Now, the element on which the event was actually first fired, so the element that caused the event to happen, is called the target element. And so in our example here, it's of course the button that was clicked. The important part is that this target element is stored as a property in the event object. And we already talked about that one, right? So this means that all the parent elements on which the event will also fire will know the target element of the event, so where the event was first fired. And that brings us to event delegation, because if the event bubbles up in the DOM tree, and if we know where the event was fired, then we can simply attach an event handler to a parent element and wait for the event to bubble up. And we can then do whatever we intended to do with our target element. And this technique is called event delegation. In this example here, we could simply add the event handler to the main element. Alright, so again, event delegation is to not set up the event handler on the original element that we're interested in, but to attach it to a parent element and basically catch the event there, because it bubbles up. And we can then act on the element that we're interested in using the target element property. And why would we actually want to do this? So let's see. There are basically two big use cases for event delegation. And the first case is when we have an element with lots of child elements that we are interested in. In this case, instead of adding an event handler to all of these child elements, we simply add it to the parent element and then determine on which child element the event was fired. And the second use case for event delegation is when we want an event handler attached to an element that is not yet in the DOM when our page is loaded. And that's of course because we cannot add an event handler to something that's not on our page. So in the case of the application that we're coding, it's actually both cases, right? So we have a lot of expense or income items that are not in the DOM when we load our page, so there's no way to attach an event handler to them. And also, there may be a lot of items, so it wouldn't be useful to have one event handler attached to each of them. And that's why we're going to use event delegation. So let's see it in practice in the next lecture. Alright, now that we know about event delegation, we're finally going to start implementing the code to delete income or expense items from the app. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn how to use event delegation in practice using the concepts of event bubbling and target element. And you're also going to learn how to use unique IDs in HTML to connect the user interface with the data model, and how to use the parent node property for DOM traversing. Alright, so we're going to start by adding an event handler here. And we do that here in our setup event listeners function, right? And remember that we're going to do event delegation. So we're going to set up the event on a parent element of the elements that we're actually interested in. So let's first check out our HTML file so that we can decide where to add or to attach our event listener. So first of all, we want our items to be deleted when the user hits on this button here, okay? So this button called item delete button. And there's one of these buttons in each and every income and also expense elements here. But again, we don't want to attach our event handler to these because we want to do event delegation. So we want to find an element that is the parent of all of these items, both the incomes and all of the expenses. And if we look closely at our HTML document structure here, we see that the first element that satisfies this condition is this one here. So this one called container. So it has the container class. And that's because all the incomes are inside of this income container here, and all of the expenses are in this expense container. So we cannot attach the event handler to these because then we would need two, but we only want one of them. So we find the element that is common to all of them, and that's again this one here, so with the class of container. So this is where we're going to put our event handler. Okay. So we say document.querySelector to selected element. And now we need to add this element to our DOM strings object up here, right? So as we always did. And I'm just going to call it container here as well. Okay, and so the class container. All right, so let's go back. So what we want is DOM Because remember, in here, in this function, it's not called DOM_strings, but DOM, which is this variable here, where we get this DOM_strings object from the UI controller, right? So DOM.container, and this is where we add our event listener. And it will be on the click event. And the function that we want to call, I'm going to call it control delete item. So control delete item. Okay, so it's a name similar to control add item. So this one will be control delete item. And so now we need to create this function, which is going to be called each time someone clicks somewhere on this container. Okay, so let's do it down here, actually after this control add item. So var control delete item. So a function, and here we go. And actually we need to pass something into this function, which is the event. And I'm sure that you remember what the event object is. So let's check out the other event handler. So in this event handler here, we also use the event object. So remember that the callback function of the addEventListener method has always access to this event object. And we can call it whatever we want. We just call it event so that we always know what it is. And so it works here in this anonymous function that we wrote here in this case, but it also works if we pass another function in it. So in this case, control delete item. And then we can also say that we want access to the event object simply by putting this parameter in here. And the reason why we need this event here is because we want to know what the target element is. So remember, that's what we talked about before. So in event delegation, an event bubbles up, and then we can know where it came from, so where it was first fired, by looking at the target property of the event. So let's simply start by console logging this property, okay? So console.log event.target. Alright, so let's now test this. Just reloading this file. Then let's hit somewhere here. So now the target of this click was this h2 element here, which actually even gets highlighted here. So if I now click somewhere here, let's say, then this one is the target element. So the element where the event was fired. So in this case where I clicked. If I click here, it's the container. So this element here. Now let me add something here. Say project. Okay, so if I now click here on this button, let's see what we get. Alright, so we clicked here on this I element, so this icon, and what this means now is that each time that we hit this button here, actually we don't hit the button, but we hit the icon, okay? So let's get back at our HTML and take a look at this I element. Okay, so this one here. So when we click on the button, we actually click on this I element. Now, when we hit the button, it is not just the button that we want to delete, right? So we actually want to delete all of this here, right? Because all of this is the item on the user interface. And each of this item is identified by their unique ID name, which is this one here. So actually, we are not interested just in this element here, which is the target one, but we're actually interested in this element here. So in this parent element. So again, this element here that we click is not actually the one that we're interested in, but it's this parent element. So this entire div element that we're actually interested in and that we want to have access to. So we need to move up in the DOM from here. And that is something called DOM traversing. So we're going to traverse the DOM. So let's see how we can do that. So back in our app file, we can now say that we want the parent node of this target. So this target property here, what it returns is an HTML node in the DOM. So when we want to move up from that, we can simply say parent node. Okay, so let's see what happens if we now hit the button. So reload, and now I need to add it again, and just something random here. Okay, and now I'm hitting it, and now we see button. So it's no longer the I element, but the button. So let's go back. And what this means is that we actually moved up to the parent element, right? So let's make this more visible. Okay. So you see, the button element here is the parent element of the I, right? Now we don't want to just move up to the button, but in fact we want to move up all the way to the income. So we don't need one parent node, but we need 2, 3, and 4. So if we want to move all the way up here, we need to use the parent node property 4 times. And we can actually do that. So like this. Parent node dot parent node dot parent node. So this actually looks a bit strange, but it's gonna work. I hope so, at least. So test something, and now I'm hitting the button again, and here we are. So this is now the div element that we're actually interested in. And in fact, what we're interested in is the ID here, because again, this is the unique identifier, let's say, of this item. So we can simply use the ID property here. So that's it. With this, we have the ID. So just to prove it to you, here it is. So income 0. If we put another one, then it's gonna be income 1, okay? So each one has this unique ID, and this is gonna be very important, and we're gonna talk about that in a second. So now instead of logging it, let's save it to a variable called item ID, okay? Let's remove this one here, and then also declare it as a variable. So item ID. Now this is probably not the cleanest solution here, using all of these parent nodes, because with this we are heavily relying on the DOM structure, right? So basically we hard-coded the DOM structure here, but let's just leave it like this, because we in fact also hard-coded the HTML in here, right? So the HTML that generates all of these items. So it's not a big deal, it's not a big problem if we also hardcode the traversing of that very DOM structure here as well. Now what happens if we click somewhere else on the page? For example, if we click here, then there is no ID, right? Or here, or whatever. Anywhere we click, there's no ID. And that's because there are no other IDs in the whole HTML document. And so we can now use this fact to say that we only want stuff to happen later if the ID is actually defined, okay? So now we can say if item ID, then we want something to happen, okay? And we already did this before, but again, this will work basically because this is going to be coerced or converted to true if this exists. And if it doesn't, then it will be coerced to false. All right. Now, what are we actually going to do with that ID? So again, let's take a look at how it is. So it basically contains both the type, so income or expense, and the unique ID of this item in our data structure, right? So 0, 1, and so on and so forth. And that is because this is exactly the way that we coded it. So let's see it back here. So in this method here, where we actually add the list items, we retrieve the ID from the new object, right? And then print it to our web page. So in case of an income, it's income and then the ID. And if it's an expense, it's expense ID. And actually let me change it here from income to inc and here to exp, so that we have always the same type designation throughout our app, and not sometimes inc and sometimes income, right? So that wouldn't be so consistent, and this way it's much better. So right now, this ID here encodes both the item type and the item ID, right? So this will be extremely useful, because later we can then use this data to tell the budget controller which item it should delete when we hit the button, and also which item should be deleted from the user interface. So let's use this ID here, okay? So back here, we now use this ID. Now the format of the ID, as we saw, is something like inc1 or whatever number. So we now need a way to split this up. And thankfully, there is a very handy method in JavaScript that all strings have access to, and that's called split. Now, you may be wondering why I said that all the strings have access to this method. Because we always said that a string is a primitive and not an object, right? Now, the thing is that as soon as we call one of these methods on a string, then JavaScript automatically puts a wrapper around the string and converts it from a primitive to an object. And then this object has access to a lot of string methods. And the same thing actually happens to numbers. So numbers also have methods, because JavaScript simply transforms them from a primitive to an object so that we can use methods on them. So we will now use the split method. So let's say split ID should be the item ID dot split. So it's a usual method. And then we say that the split string should be the dash. Okay. And I will show you this in a second. Let me just declare it here. So split ID. Okay. So let's actually test this out in the console to see what the result will be. So imagine that we use this string var s is inc1, and then we say s dot split, like we did before. And so what this returns is an array wherein the first element is inc, so this part that comes before, or split string here, and then the second element is what comes after that. Okay? And s could even be bigger than that. So imagine it would be inc1 type 3, whatever, it doesn't really matter, just to show it to you. And then it would return an array of all of these elements that come after and before these split strings. So basically this allows us to break up a string into different parts and removing then the split string. So now we can simply say that the type is split ID 0, right? Because remember, this is the array that we just saw, and the first element is the type, right? Because it's this inc. So income or expense are the types. And I also need to declare this, of course. So type, and then we're also going to have ID. So that's the next one. So ID is the split ID and element number 1. So the second element, in fact. All right, and now we have all the ingredients to be able to delete the item from both the user interface and our data model, so the budget controller. And so let's look what we had on our to-do list for this part of the application. So first, we wanted to delete the item from the data structure. Then we delete the item from the user interface, and then we update and show the new totals. Or the new budget, actually, because that's the way we've been calling it, right? Because of course, as soon as we remove an item from the expense or from the incomes, then all of the budget has to be updated. So in the next lectures, we're going to create a function in the budget controller for this one. So for deleting from the data structure, and then a method for deleting the item from the user interface. And then finally, we want to update and show the new budget. So just to recap what we did in this lecture, we first set an event listener here to the container, which is the first element that all of the income and expense items have in common. So this is where we set our event listener. And we did it so because we want to do event delegation, which means that instead of adding one event listener to all of the elements that we're interested in, like all the incomes and all the expense items, we add them to the container and then let the event bubbling up. So the function that we then attach to the container is to control delete item, which is this one here, okay? And then from here we read the target element, okay? So using the event.target property, which is exactly the element where the click happened, so where the event was fired. And we then moved up in the DOM, so we traversed the DOM all the way up to the element that we're actually interested in. And then in here we retrieved the ID from it and stored it here in this variable. And this variable is going to be very useful for us because we know that in here is encoded the item type, so if it's an expense or an income, and also the unique ID. So we then isolated each of these into a different variable using the split method for the string. And so now the stage is set so that we can delete the item from the data structure and from the user interface over the next lectures. Let's now create a new method in our budget controller so that we can delete an item from our data structure. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn yet another method to loop over an array, which is called map, and you'll learn how to remove elements from an array using the splice method. So let's do that. So here's our budget controller in which we will add yet another public method. So let's actually put it here after the add item. We will have the method to delete an item. So delete item, a function, and so this is our method. Now we know that this method is going to be called by the budget controller, right? So what kind of information do we need to have in order to be able to delete an item from the data structure? So what parameters, what arguments does the app controller have to pass into this method? So let's look at our data structure. So here it is. And we know that in these arrays, we will have all of our expense objects and all of our income objects. Okay? And both expense and income objects, they are both identified by their unique ID, right? So what we need in order to delete one of the items from these arrays is we first need to know if we're talking about an expense or an income, and then we also need the unique ID. So this is what the controller will have to pass into this function. And so we need to set up the parameters here. So the type, which is the way we've been calling it, and ID. All right. Now imagine that we pass an ID of, let's say, 3 into this function. So 3. We cannot simply select the element that we want to delete like this. So data.allItems type, and then just use the ID here, right? So we cannot do it like this. So this would select our array here, right? So for example, the expense array, and then select the element number 3 using this, right? Now this would work if we were certain that the IDs are all in order like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we know that it's not the case. And we already talked about that when we wrote this method here, right? So we had this example here. So imagine these are the IDs. And so let's actually copy this example. So imagine these were the IDs. If you would then select the element number 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and would then delete it, you would not delete the element with the ID of 3, but with the ID of 6, right? So this is not what we want. And again, the reason for the fact that these are not all in order like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on and so forth is the fact that we can delete items. And so in this case, for example, the elements with the ID 0 and 3 and 5 and 7 were all deleted, and that's why they're not here anymore in this example. And so we need to take that into account when we write this method. So what can we do now? The solution here is to create an array with all of the ID numbers that we have and then find out what the index of our input ID is. So basically the index of the element that we want to remove. So let's say that the ID that we want to remove is 6, for example, right? Then the index is not simply 6, as we already discussed, but instead it's 0, 1, 2, 3. So the index in this case would be 3. So we need a way to find out why it's 3, so why it's the number 3 that we need to delete. So again, the solution is to create an array with all the ID numbers that we have. So let's comment this part out as well, because none of that is what we're going to do. Instead, what we're going to do is to loop over all of the elements in an incomes or an expenses array. So data dot all items and then the type that we pass in. And now let's meet a new method here. So before we used the for each method, right? But there is another one which is very similar called map. Okay, and map also receives a function, a callback function, which also has access to the current element, the current index, and the entire array. Okay. But the difference between map and for each is that map actually returns a brand new array. So in here, so in this function, in this callback function that is called for each element, we will always return something, and this will then be stored in a new array. So let's say return 2 simply. If we now say var IDs, then we would end up with a brand new array with the same length as the all items type array, but with the number 2 in all of the elements. So this of course wouldn't be so useful, because what we want is not a 2 in all of them, but what we want is the current ID. Okay? So going back to our example before, imagine that in the all items type we had 5 income objects which had these IDs, so 1, 2, 4, 6 and 8. So after executing this map method, we would end up with exactly this array. Okay? So let's actually call it IDs. Okay, so that we keep this as an example. And now all we need to do is to find that index. And we already know how to do that, right? So we say index is IDs dot index of the ID that we pass into the method. And it's really as simple as that. So let's now declare these, so IDs and index. All right. So remember, this index of method returns the index number of the element of the array that we input here. So again, imagine that the ID would be 6, then the index would be 0, 1, 2, 3, because this is the 6 that we're searching. And so this index variable here would become 3. So index equals 3. And now all we need to do is to actually delete this item from the array, right? Okay. And remember that this index here can be -1 in case that this item here is not found in the array in which we're searching. So we only want to remove something if the index actually exists, right? So if the index is different from -1, because -1 is when it didn't find the element. So if the index is different from -1, then we want to delete. And now, in order to delete, we're going to meet yet another method of the array. And this one is called splice. So don't confuse it with the slice method that we used before. This one is called splice. And this one is used to remove elements, while the slice elements is only used to create a copy. And so let's see how to use that. So data.allItems type, and this is the array of our objects, right? So on this array, we now can use the splice method. And it works like this. So the first argument is the position number at which we want to start deleting. And this is of course the index. And then the second argument is the number of elements that we want to delete. And we of course only want to delete one. So again, this will start removing elements at the number index, which, if we come back to our example, is number 3. So at number 3, it will remove exactly 1. So in our case, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then this one would get removed, like this, okay? Okay, so I hope that this small example here actually helped you understand why we needed to do it this way instead of just writing out this piece of code here. Instead, we had to create this entire array here and then retrieve the index of the element that we want to remove. So this one was a bit tricky, but we still solved it, right? And you also learned yet another 2 methods for arrays by writing this method. So I hope that you somewhere keep track of all these methods that we have already used on arrays so that you don't lose sight of all the amazing things that we can do with arrays. And now the last step is to just use this method in the controller. So where is our method for that, or function actually for that? It's here. So the control delete item function. And so we say budget controller delete item. And now is the time where we can finally use this type and this ID that we created in the last lecture. Remember that? So we can now simply pass in the type, which is what our method expects, and the ID as well. And like this, the element with the specified ID and the specified type will be deleted from our data structure. So let's now see this in action, okay? So reload. Alright, so we have a bug here somewhere. So in line 82, let's check that out. Line 82 all the way up here. Okay, we have 1 equal too much. Okay, so the equal operator is with 3 equals, and the difference operator is with this exclamation mark and the 2 equal signs. Okay, so again, and now the application has started. So let's add something to here. Let's say test1, $10. Test2, let's say 20, and test3, 30. Alright. Now remember, if we click here to delete this, nothing will happen on the user interface. So we actually need to see our data structure, and we have our nice handy testing method here for that, right? So here's the object that we created with all the items, which are these 3 incomes. So 3 income objects with 10, 20, and $30. So let's now remove the second one. Alright, and we have a bug. So yet another one. So let's go to line 282. And 282 is down here. Okay, so this was a stupid mistake. It's of course ID with the capital letters and not like it was before. So I hope now it's gonna work. So test1, test2, and test3. And now let's delete this. Alright, so I clicked the button, and again, it wasn't removed from here, but let's take a look at our data structure. So our testing method, and now if we look at here, oh, we still have 3. So there's clearly still something wrong here. And since there's nothing happening here, so nothing happens when we hit these buttons here, So there's not even a bug, nothing happens really. So I suspect that there's something wrong with the if statement that we have. So let's go back. So this if here, remember that this gets only executed when the ID that we pass into is actually in the array. So when it's not -1 here, okay? And since this here is simply not executing, it means that probably this here always returns -1, and therefore this here is always false. So there must be some problem in here. And so let's check the ID. Maybe there's something wrong with the ID. So let's go down here. And so yeah, here's where we define the ID. So let's see how we did that. So we split this string here in two, and then this created a new array, which is split ID, which had the two strings in it. So the type string, which is the first element of the array, and the ID string, which is the second element of the array. So the one with the index number 1. And maybe now you're starting to see the problem, and the problem is this. So we pass this ID into our delete item method, but remember that this is a string because it came from this item ID string. And therefore, up there in our delete item method, we are comparing a string to a number. So that's something that we cannot do. I mean, we can, but it's not going to give us the results that we want. So if we ask that the string 1 is in an array of 0, 1, and 2, which are all numbers, then the string 1 is not in there because what's in there is the number 1, okay? So we want this ID, this one here, to be a number so that we can then ask if the number is in the array with the index of method. So remember, we used the parse float function before, which was to convert a string to a float number, so a number with decimals. Now these IDs are integers, right? So no decimals. And so there's another function which is simply called parse int. So we're going to use that one here. So parse int. And just like this, we convert the string here to an integer, so to a number, which is then stored in ID. And so let's now check out if this works, okay? So reload, and then test1, 10, test2, 20, and test3, 30. And in here are our 3 income objects. And now I'm going to delete this one. So again, we have no bug. So let's see our structure now. And yes, so now it's working. Now we have only 2 elements in our array. So great. So let's see the first one. It's test1. And the second one should be test3. Sorry. So test3, yeah. Because I deleted test2. Remember, I clicked here and I deleted it. So now it's finally working. And what we need to do next is to actually also delete the item here from the user interface, right? And then update the budget here because this still stays the same. So I can delete all of this and nothing happens in the budget, right? So let's just check our data structure now that I deleted all of them. And so yeah, so we no longer have any income here because I deleted all of them. Okay, so this really works, and now we're ready for the next lecture. This is the last lecture about removing an element from our application, and all we have left to do is to actually remove the item from the user interface. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn some more DOM manipulation, and more specifically, how to remove an element from the DOM. And so in order to remove something from the user interface, we create a brand new method here in our UI controller. So here we have addListItem, and so after that, I'm going to put deleteListItem. So a function, once again, And what do we need to know in order to be able to remove an element from the DOM? That's right, we need a class name or an ID name so that we can first select it and then remove it. And in this case, of course, we're going to use an ID because we've been talking about that all the time. So let's say selector ID, right? And the ID that we're going to pass into this will be, of course, this entire ID here. So the one that we read from the DOM in the first place. So we don't want just the type or the ID, but we want the entire ID that we read. So for example, the income 0 or the income 1, right? So that we can then go ahead and delete this item, right? So for example, this item or this item, this is what we want to delete. And so let's do that in our method. And removing something from the DOM is actually pretty simple, because for that we have the removeChild method. Okay, and since it's the removeChild method, we first need to know the parent, right? So basically we have to move up in the DOM so that we can then remove the child. So this is a bit strange, but in JavaScript we cannot simply delete an element, we can only delete a child. So remove a child. So we start by selecting the element, as always. So document dot, and now since we have an ID here, I will use getElementById. We haven't used that in a long time, right? So getElementById and then selector ID. So this is our item that we want to remove. But remember, we can only remove a child. So we first need to move up, and we already did that before, and we do that using the parent node property. So parent node, and now we can say from here we want to remove a child, and then we need to again select it. So really this is a bit strange, as I was saying, but it's just how it works. So we need to pass this into here again. So this is how it works. Now I would suggest to not do it this way, but to first actually save the selection here in a separate variable, right? So let's say element is this, okay? And so then we say element, then we want the parent node from that element, and then we remove the child, which is this element. So pretty weird, but yeah, that's how it works. There's actually an excellent reference that I found where lots of these things are explained. So lots of DOM manipulations like this. So let's take a look at that. I already have it here. And you can also find it on my resource page, as always. And here we have a comparison between jQuery and the JavaScript DOM API. So this is for, let's see, removing elements here. So this is what we did here, right? So we selected an element, then set parent node and remove child and the element again, right? But here is a lot of different stuff that we can do, and some of that we already did. For example, let's see, so creating and inserting elements before and after is what we did here. So insert adjacent HTML, and we already used, I don't know if it was the after and, but it was something like this, okay? And so in here, you can find something for your needs if you want to do some DOM manipulation, like inserting or removing elements from the DOM. Okay, so our delete list item method is actually complete with this. So this is a pretty simple one, because all we really wanted to do here is to just remove this element. So let's now call it. So in here, so UI controller dot delete list item. All right, and now remember, we have to pass in the ID, and it's the item ID as we were talking about right in the beginning. All right, and now all we have left to do is to update and show the new budget. But that's really simple, right? Because we already have this code. So let's go here to our control add item function, so this one. So when we coded this part of the application, we already had this function here which does exactly what we want. So let's just copy this and paste it here. Alright. And that's why back then I said that we should create a function to update the budget, because we were going to use it again, and now is that time. So instead of writing the same code here in this function and in this function, we created an update budget function which contains all of the stuff that we do here. So let's remember what this is. So we calculate the budget, then we get the budget, so we basically read it from the budget controller, and then we display it on the user interface with the UI controller. Okay, so let's check this out. So I'm refreshing it, and then let's say salary 1500 or something like this, okay? And sold car 2000. And let's remove it. And it's gone. So it's working. So really cool. And did you see that also this budget here was updated? So not only was the element actually removed, but also the budget was updated. So let's remove this one as well. And so we're back to 0. So let's add an expense. Holiday 500. And now another income like logo design for $2,500. So a great logo probably, right? And now salary again. So all of this has updated, of course. And now I'm removing this one. And yeah, again, it updated. It updated here. And so everything works perfectly. Let's only just look at our budget again and check if this is also empty. And yeah, it is. So, perfect. And with this, we concluded the part 2 of the project, which was just to delete an item here from our application. And we did that perfectly. So our app is growing and growing and is getting better and better. So let's now move on to see what's next. Welcome back. Now that we have 2 out of 3 steps completed, let's look at what we have achieved so far. So this is the updated version of our app's structure. And now we also have the new functions and methods for deleting an item here that we just coded. So this is an overview of everything that happens when the user clicks one of the delete buttons. And this makes it visible why it was so important to create the update budget function, because it's used to update and display the budget changes after both adding and deleting an item. So let's move on to planning the rest of our app. So this is going to be the last step in coding our application. And so what is there left to do? The first thing that comes to my mind is these percentages here that show how much each expense represents in percentage of the total income. So that's the main thing that we're going to take care of now. So we calculate the percentages and of course update them in the user interface. Another thing that we have left to do is to display the correct month and year at the top of our app, because currently we only have some placeholder there. And there are actually a couple more things that we can do to improve our app, like getting this nice number formatting that we see all over the place here, and improve the user experience of the input fields in order to make it more clear if we're inputting an income or an expense. Alright, so yet another to-do list for us to work on here. And after doing all of this, we're going to be finished with our application. So are you as excited as I am to continue with this right now? Then join me right in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to start with updating the income percentages, which is the main task for this step 3 of our project. And this will be more of a short lecture, and so we're just going to reinforce some of the concepts and techniques that we have learned so far. So here we are once again in our app controller. Now the question that we should ask is, when will these income percentages actually be updated? And the answer is that these percentages are calculated and updated each time that we add or delete an item. Because remember, these percentages are the percentage of the income that each expense represents. So when we add a new income or when we delete an income from the list, then all of these expense percentages will be updated. They will all change. And also when we add a new expense, the percentage must be calculated and of course updated and displayed. So again, when we add and when we delete an item, and this means that we should probably create a new separate function for this so that we can then call that function here in our control add item function, in our control delete item function. Okay, so this is something very similar to the update budget function here, right? So we also created a function for that, a separate function here, which is called update budget, and then called it in both of these control functions here, right? And so now we're going to do something similar, and I'm going to call it update percentages simply. Update percentages. And we don't need any arguments here. And that's it. All right, and what are we going to do here in this function? And again, this is very similar to the update budget function. So we first need to calculate the percentages. Then after that, we're going to read them from the budget controller. So very similar again. And finally, we then update the user interface. With the new percentages. And we're going to do that such as we did before over the next two lectures. So in the next lecture, we're going to take care of the budget controller and then code these two functions here to calculate and to get. So similar to calculating the budget and then getting the budget. And then finally, we're going to code a method which will then display these percentages on the user interface. But for now, all we need to do is to call this function here in our other two functions, right? So in here, we have a step 6, which is to calculate and update the percentages. And update percentages. And this one is called update percentages. So we call this function from here so that we don't have to write the exact same code down here in the function that handles the deleting of an item. Okay, and calculate and update percentages. And in here it's just step number 4. Alright, so in the next lecture we're going to take care of coding these two methods into our budget controller. Let's now create the methods that will do the actual calculations of the expense percentages. And so in this lecture, you'll learn how to make the budget controller interact with our expense prototype. So let's start by adding a new method to our budget controller. And it's going to be another public method. So calculate budget, get budget. And so I'm going to put the calculate methods basically here together, okay? So we have calculate budget and now calculate percentages. Okay, so let's think about this. So basically, we need to calculate the expense percentage for each of the expense objects that are stored in the expenses array, right? So imagine that we had 3 expenses, and I'm going to write them here as an example. So imagine we had A 20, then expense B of 10, and then another expense, let's call it C, of 40, okay? So just an example. And our total income would be 100. So what would the percentages for each of these be? So for A, we would have 20 divided by 100. right? So this makes 20%. So with expense A, this means that we spend 20% of our total income. And then of course, in the same way, B would be 10 divided by 100, so it would be 10%, and C would be 40%, right? So this is just so that we know how to calculate each of these percentages. So this means that we're always going to need this total income here. Now, we said that we need to do this for each object individually. And so this sounds like there should be a method on each of these expense objects that calculates this percentage, right? And so let's actually do that. So let's go to our expense function constructor here. So in here, and we want to add a method. So how do we do that? And I'm absolutely sure that you remember this. So we're not just going to add the method right here into the function constructor, right? But instead, we're going to add it to its prototype. Because like this, all of the objects that are created through this expense prototype will then inherit this method because of the prototype chain, right? Because it's in their prototype. So the prototype property of expense. So let me do that. We did this before a lot of times, so we already know how to do this. So expense.prototype, and let's call this method the calculate percentage, or just calc percentage. Okay, and we already know that we always need something in order to be able to calculate the percentage of one of the expenses, right? And we just talked about that. And that is the total income. So total income. Okay, so now we can calculate our actual percentage. But first, where are we going to store this percentage? We should actually create a new property here in the expense object, right? So let's do that. So this dot percentage. And in the beginning, before it's defined, I'm going to set it to -1, such as we did somewhere else in our code before, right? So when something is not defined, we use -1. And so now here in this method, we can then define this property to something meaningful. So this dot percentage will be the value of this expense, right? So the value divided by the total income, which is the argument that we receive as an input here. Now, such as we did before, in another function, we will multiply this by 100 and then also round it. So again, we're using the math object and then round. And with this, we have an integer percentage value. So we did this before in this way. Let's remember it. So yeah, it was here. So when we calculated the budget, we also calculated the, let's say, global percentage. And so we also divided the expense by the income, multiplied it with 100 and then rounded it. And something else that we did here was to only calculate this when the income was actually greater than 0 here, right? And that's because we cannot divide anything by 0. So we should do the same in our method that we're writing right now. So in here, I'm going to do the same thing. So if the total income is greater than 0, and only then we calculate this percentage like this. And if it's 0, then the percentage will just be -1 again. Alright, and that's it. So this method calculates the percentage. And since we always have a get method, so for example a get budget and a get percentage, which we're going to write in a second, I will also create a get percentage method for this expense object or function constructor. So expense.prototype.get percentage. And this of course will be the simplest function ever, right? Because it's just going to retrieve the percentage from the object and then return it. But this again is so that we have different functions which each one only has one specific task. So this one calculates it and then this one returns it. Okay, so let's now use this method actually. So this is the one that we were working on here, so the calculate percentages method. And now we can call the method that we just wrote for each of the elements in the array in our data structure, right? So for all of the expense objects that are stored here in this data structure, okay? And do you remember the new method that we learned to loop over arrays? Yes, it was the for each method. So let's use it now again. So we first need our array. So we're going to retrieve it from our data structure. So data, all items. And in this case, we only want the expense array, right? And now in here, we can call the for each method because this is an array. And now our callback function. So this specifies exactly what we want to happen for each of the elements. So we have access to the current variable here, right? I'm just going to call it cur in this case. And what I want to happen to each of the elements is to simply call the calc percentage method. So I write current and then calc percentage, which is the method that we coded before. And that's it. So this is going to calculate the percentage for each and every expense that we have in our object. And now we just need the get percentages. So get percentages. And some space here as well. And alright. And this one will actually be a bit similar because we once again need to loop over all of our expenses. And that's because we want to call the get percentage method on each of our objects. The difference to the loop that we wrote here in our other method is that this time we don't want to just loop over the array and do something. No, we also want to return something. So we want to store it somewhere. And remember, that's what the map method is for. So instead of for each, we're going to use map. So var all percentages, let's say, is data dot all items exp, so the expenses, and then I use map because remember map returns something and stores it in a variable while for each does not. And now our callback function again. And now in here in the callback function of the map method, we usually just return something. And what we return here is what is then stored here in this variable. So we just return the result of calling the get percentage method. And in the end, all we need to do is then to return the allPerc variable, which is of course an array with all of the percentages. So again, imagine we had 5 objects in our exp array here, in our expenses array. So then this here would get called 5 times, right? So for each of the 5 elements. So for each of them, we would call the get percentage method, return it, and then store it here in the all percentages array. And then in the end, we just return it. All right. And so with these 3 methods, we calculate the percentage on each individual object, and we then return an array with all of these percentages in it. So let's now use these methods that we just coded here in our controller. And remember, we created this update percentages function in the last lecture. And in here, we will now say budget controller dot calculate percentages. And then we just say that we want to get the percentages. And of course, we need to store this somewhere, right? So var percentages. And now, since we can't see anything in the user interface just yet, I'm going to log it to the console. So console.log percentages. All right, so it's time to test this. And I'm going to use the example that we had before. So project 100 is our income, and our 3 expenses are going to be A of 20. And now we have some kind of bug here. Okay, so let's go to line 135. Okay, 135. And okay, so of course there's a problem because we used current here, but the parameter name is core, right? So just like this. So it's completely normal that we sometimes have some bugs that we do this kind of mistakes, and everyone does that. So it's really no big deal. So let's try this again. So I'm just calling it inc here. And then on 3 expenses. So A is 20. And now we see -1 here in the console, which is weird, right? So let's see why that happened. So the percentage can only be -1 if the income is 0, right? But the income is not actually 0. So let's see what we did wrong. So the calculate percentage method here. And so here's the problem. So we called the calc percentage method and didn't pass the totals into it, which we should have. So let's do that now. And we already know where that is stored. So data, totals, right, and then inc. So let me show it to you just to remember. So it's this value here. So the total income is stored right here. And hopefully now it's the 3rd time and now it's going to work. So income 100. And let's add an expense of 10. Sorry, A is 10. And yes, so 10 is 10%. Actually, let's try it with an income of 200. And then have A equal 10. And now it's going to be 5%, right? And yes, here it is. And now B, let's say 50. And this should be 25%, right? And yeah, so now we have 5 and 25. So these are the percentages that we're later going to display here. So it will be 5 here and then 25. And if we now add another one like C, which is going to be 40, then this one is of course 20%. So 5, 25, and 20. And these are the percentages that we're going to put here right in the next lecture. In this final step of updating the expense percentages, we're just going to display them to the UI. In this lecture, you're going to learn how to create your own for each function, but for node lists instead of arrays. So by now you already know where we're going to add our new method, right? And that's right here in the UI controller. And let's do it here. And we'll just call it display percentages. And of course, this method is going to receive the percentage array that we have stored in our app controller, right? So that's what we did in the last lecture, if you remember. So an argument called percentages, and this is going to be an array. Okay, so these are the percentages that we will display, but where are we going to actually display them? So let's take a look at the HTML. And they're of course not in the incomes, but in the expenses. And this is called item percentage. So we need to start by selecting all of the elements which have the item percentage class. So let's go back. And once again, I'm going to edit in here, right? So expenses percentage label, let's say. And I'm not sure if I copied it. No, I did not. All right. So let's go back. So it's item percentage. All right. And here we go. So expenses percentage label. All right, and now this time we don't know how many expense item will be on the list. So we cannot use query selector because that only selects the first one. So we need to again use query selector all. So let's create a variable called fields and then say document query selector all. And from our DOM strings, we want to expenses percentage label. All right, and this again returns a list. And actually it's called a node list, not just list, but node list. And that is because in a DOM tree, where all of the HTML elements of our page are stored, each element is called a node. And that's also why the property that we used before for moving up in the DOM was called parent node. So we need to now loop over all of these elements in our selection, so all of these nodes, and then change the text content property for all of them, such as we did before. Now, we already know that the node list does not have the for each method, right? So we could again use the hack that we used before, so where we used the slice method of the array prototype to convert the node list into an array. But as I said, that's more of a hack, so like a workaround, and we can actually do better. So instead, let's create our own for each function, but for node lists instead of arrays. And with this actually, we can use some of the knowledge that we gained before about callback functions and passing functions around like variables. So imagine that we already have this function. How would we want to use it? So we want to call node list for each. Okay, so this is how we're going to call the function that we're going to code in a second. And then we want to pass into it our fields, of course, and a callback function, right? So this is similar to the for each for arrays, but this is going to be for node list. And then in here, we want our callback function with the current and the index. So exactly as we are used from the for each method. And then here we do some stuff. So let's now write actually this function, and I'm going to copy it. So var node list for each is a function. And as we saw here, this function is going to accept a list, a node list, but instead I'm just going to write list so that our parameter name is not too big. And then the callback function, right? So this here is what we pass into the node list for each function. So a list and then our callback here, right? So what is this function going to do? It will simply be a for loop that in each iteration is going to call our callback function. So something very simple actually, but by putting it into a separate function, we have here a piece of reusable code that we could then use for all of the node lists throughout our app, or even in other apps that you're going to code in the future. So each time that you have a node list, you can then go ahead and simply use this node list for each function here, instead of writing your own for loop each time and then put something inside of that. So for var I is 0, of course, and I should be smaller than the list dot length. And so please note that the node list actually has the length property. So it doesn't have all of these fancy methods that we would like to use on it, but it has the length property, so we can use that here. And now we just increment our counter. And what are we going to do in here? So very simple, we simply call our callback function. And now here's the thing. What are the parameters of our callback function? They are the current and the index. And so we can now simply pass them into our callback function by writing them here, right? So the current is the list at position I, and the index is simply I. So it's as simple as that. So does that make sense to you? This is really the power of first-class functions and of being able to pass functions around like this. So what we just did here is something really powerful. So let me explain it again. So when we call our node list for each function, we pass a callback function into it, right? Which is this one. And it doesn't have any code yet, but we're going to put that there in a second. So this function is assigned to this callback parameter. And so in here, we then loop over our list, let's say 5 times if there are 5 elements in it. And then in each iteration, the callback function gets called with these arguments here, which are exactly the ones that we specified here, right? And so then 5 times our code that we have here is going to be executed. And we have then access to the current element and to the current index because we passed them into the callback in here. So let's now use this to display these percentages on our web page. So we can simply say that we want the current element, and now we can use the text content property, right? Which we have used 100 times by now. And so what we want is the percentages at the position index. So imagine at the first element, we want the first percentage, right? At the second element, we want the second percentage in the array. So it's going to be percentages index 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in the case that we have 5 percentage values. So that's the percentage. And then we simply want to add this percentage sign, such as we did before. And that's actually it. Well, not really, because imagine that the percentage is 0, right? And we did that before, and we can actually see it up here. So what we said here is that if the percentage is 0, we display the percentage like this, so with the percentage sign. But if it's 0, we simply want to display this string here, okay? So instead of -1, because that would look weird. So we can say if percentages at the position index, so the current percentage, if it's greater than 0, then make this. And else, simply display these 3 dashes. Alright, and with this, we concluded our display percentage method. So again, we used a really powerful methodology here by writing this node list function here, this node list for each function. And if you didn't fully understand how this works, then just pause the video and take a look at exactly what happens here. Alright, so now it's time to actually use or display percentages method. So where is it? So this file is really getting big, and sometimes it's a bit hard to find a place, but it's here. So UI controller that display percentages. And again, what we want to pass here is this variable called percentages, right? Which is this one here, which comes from calling the getPercentages method on the budget controller. And that's it. Let's test this out now. And let's put our income of 200 here again. And then A of 10. Oh, sorry. This should have been an expense, of course. So again, A of 10. And yes, it's 10%. Let me actually delete this one. So this is working, right? So you have 5%, and it's correct because 10 is in fact 5% of 200. So let's add another one